Guys, I want to tell you a little bit something that I've discovered about myself that I think maybe many of you guys can relate with. I like to win. How many of you guys like to win? Anybody like to win? I like to win, not just in games, not just at like sports, but just at stuff. I see things and I want to conquer it. I discovered this again about myself here a couple weeks ago. Took a drive up to Taos to go up and watch my daughter play volleyball. I told a couple that had gone to church here and moved up there that the next time she played up there, I was going to go up and see them, and I went up, and then they weren't there. So I decided when I went up to Taos that I would go hike a mountain, which is just really weird. I'm looking around. Tallest mountains in New Mexico are right there, and I thought to myself, I'm going to go take down one of those. And so I drove up to Taos Ski Valley. I'd never been to Taos Ski Valley before, and I'm looking at my watch, and it was 1 o'clock, and I had to be back down at the high school at about 4, and so I thought, what's the nearest mountain on my map that I can get to and go get? And I saw that there was a mountain called Bull of the Woods Mountain, and it was like 11,600 feet or something like that, and I was at 9,500 feet, and I thought, I can do this. I can make it happen. So I put my head down, and I started hiking, and I kept going, and when I started cramping and everything like that, I didn't stop. I just pushed through, and I pushed through, and I pushed through. I didn't quit, and I got to stand on the top of this mountain above the tree line. I got to look out over all of God's beautiful creation. It was amazing. I'm not telling you this to like build myself up or make myself look good, because there's plenty of stuff not to look good. But it was amazing to get to do that. And I saw how cool it is to be able to just push through and get up there. As I was standing up there, I looked off to the east, and there was the Red River Valley, and I looked off to the west, and I could see the valley that goes into Taos. I could see the ski resort. It was just unbelievable. And there's a cool feeling when you get to go and conquer something like that. Do you know what I'm talking about? When you put your head down and there's something you look at and you think, I don't know if I can do this. And you attack it and you do it and you feel great, and it was awesome. I'm telling you that story because that's the feeling that I love. But what I see in Scripture, what we see in the sermon series that we're doing is something completely different, and it makes it really hard for me. We're doing this series called #Blessed, and it's over the Beatitudes of Jesus. And what I see in Jesus, in the words of Jesus, are feelings and things that he is telling us are good things that he is saying we're lucky to have, that seem exactly opposite of the things that I want. It seem like they're opposite of the things that I push for. And I'm having a hard time, honestly, trying to figure out how to process this. A couple weeks ago, Brandon got up and he preached over the first beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit. The poor in spirit are blessed because theirs is the kingdom of God. Poor in spirit, I can wrap my mind around as something good. Right? What Brandon said is that when you're poor in spirit, you realize your own brokenness, and that's when you start to be able to move, is when you finally realize that you're broken. And I can put that in my mind, and it makes sense. But I'm going to tell you right now, I still don't want to be poor in spirit. Like, I still don't want in my flesh to be the one who doesn't have it all together. Right? Last week, Brandon talked about blessed are the mourn, for they will be comforted. Those who mourn are the ones that God says are lucky, because those are the ones that are going to be comforted. He says, and what Brandon said last week is when we mourn, we get to this place when we're realizing we can mourn over our sin and we realize our brokenness. This is when the transition starts to happen. And I agree in my head, but I don't want that. I don't want to mourn. I don't like to mourn. I just don't. Right? I'd rather be happy. And so I'm trying to take the words of Jesus, because I know that what Jesus is saying is true. I'm trying to take the words of Jesus and take it into my heart. And it's a struggle, especially when I look at the word today. This is maybe the hardest one for me as a man. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, Jesus says these words, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." The meek are blessed. The meek are lucky, is what Jesus is saying. And I don't want to be seen as meek. You see, meekness is equated with weakness to me, right? The idea of somebody who's meek is somebody who just sits back and takes it when somebody's attacking them and just lets people put them in bad places and be taken advantage of. And I'm looking at this and I find my flesh just fighting against it. And so I have to ask myself, is Jesus wrong? Or is this something that's a problem for me? And as I look at the scriptures, as I see Jesus, what I realize is my own struggles and my own weakness. I start to see my own pride get in the way. This is the struggle when we look at the Beatitudes. We look at these things and we say, yes, they are blessed because Jesus says that they're blessed, but I don't want those things for myself. And what my goal is today, here's my goal for you guys today. What I want to get to today, because this is where I'm trying to get myself to, I want to get to the place where if I had bumper stickers made up that says, I am meek, you would want to take one and put it on your car. Would you want that on your car right now? Because why? People are going to run you off the road, right? They're going to take advantage of you. They're going to say, sweet, there's the sheep, like take you out. But Jesus says that that's what we should want. Jesus seems to be saying that that's what we should want, is to be meek, is to be people who are seen as meek, because those are the ones who will inherit the earth. So that's kind of confusing, right? Let's dig into the word today. I want to look at this because I think that there's a truth here that we can start to understand. Jesus isn't just telling us that we need to be meek. It's not just something that he commanded of us. Meekness isn't something that Jesus commended. It's something that he lived. And so what I want to look at this morning is a couple stories. A couple stories of times when Jesus lived this out and why it is that he's calling us to this. Because I think when we understand what meekness is and what he's calling us to, we understand how this is what transforms the world. So if you guys have your Bibles, turn to Luke chapter 9, verse 51 through 56. If you don't have a Bible, there's actually a Bible in the seats in front of you, underneath the seats in front of you, and you're welcome to take that one, use it, mark it up, take it home. We want to have everybody who comes to worship with us get into the Word. We're going to be looking first at Luke chapter 9, verse 51 through 56, as we study this idea that the meek are blessed. I want to take a look at that and understand. So here's the story here in verse 51 through 56. Jesus is about to take his disciples and start to take them into Jerusalem, and he's pointing himself towards ultimately his own sacrifice and his death. With that in mind, let's read this. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him, who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him because his face was set towards Jerusalem. And when the disciples saw James and John, or when his disciples James and John saw it, they said, Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But he turned and rebuked them, and they went on their way to another village. This is a crazy story. This is not something that you probably heard about in Sunday school class growing up. But here's the story. Jesus and his disciples were going to Jerusalem, and as they were traveling along, Jesus was starting to tell them about his real purpose for coming. And as they're going along, he sent the disciples forward to the towns that in front of them to make preparations so that when he got there with him and the followers, there would be some place for him to stay. And they show up at the Samaritan town, and they go in, and the Samaritan town says, we don't want you or your people to come here. You guys are going to Jerusalem, just go to Jerusalem. We don't want you here. And so James and John go back to Jesus, and they say, Jesus, they just rejected you. Do you mind if maybe we ask God to send fire down on this town and blow it up? That's kind of cool in a really scary, creepy, morbid way. What Jesus said to them, though, is really unbelievable. Jesus doesn't say to them, you guys are stupid, I can't do that. Jesus doesn't say to them, what were you thinking? Jesus doesn't say to them, you know what, you're right. They deserve it. How dare they reject me? I'm their hope. How dare they do this? Go ahead. Instead, Jesus turns to them and he rebukes them for wanting to call down fire on this town, and they move along from there. Why doesn't he allow them to call down fire on this community? I mean, he is the hope. This starts to paint a picture of why Jesus came. Jesus exhibited this meekness when he was under attack because Jesus didn't come to be avenged in the first place. We see a little glimpse of his purpose in this story right here. Because he had the ability to do this. He had the ability to call down fire. He had the ability to curse this town. He had the ability to put those people in their place. And so when James and John, who are called the sons of thunder because they had tempers, they came to Jesus and they said, let us call down fire on this place. Jesus didn't rebuke them because they were stupid. He rebuked them because they didn't understand his purpose in the first place. I've got to be honest. When people do me wrong, it's really hard to be meek. Right? When people belittle you or attack you, when people put you in a bad place, the last thing that you want to do is show meekness. At least if you're me, if you're anything like me. So when Jesus does this, what he is doing is he's taking their mentality and what they perceive as needed, and he's twisting it and he's turning it. In our world today as the church, I think we would be much more like James and John than we are like Jesus. When people attack Jesus, in our world today, it's kind of easy to look at them and say, God, why don't you just send them to hell? I mean, they don't want you anyway. They don't want what God wants. They don't want what you want, Jesus. So why are they even here? But instead of rebuking those people, Jesus rebuked his disciples. Because Jesus came for something different. And so he walked by this town. And as he's walking by this town, you can imagine the people in the town, if they're paying any attention to him at all, are making fun of him. Not realizing that they've just received grace from him in a gift of life that they didn't deserve. That meekness, this is what it is. Meekness expresses itself in patient submissiveness to offense, free from malice and desire for revenge. And those are big words, but it helps us to understand exactly what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about this here. Meekness shows itself in submitting to offense and submitting to being offended against instead of having malice and a need for revenge. Meekness really shows itself in that willingness to show something different when people attack you. Our fleshly answer to any attack is to attack back, right? We think that the only way that we're going to get what we need is to attack people when they attack us. We may not say it, but we think it. But I want to ask you, how many of us have lived that out and seen that work out? How many of you, if you're married, have ever told your spouse, you know what, you're an idiot, I can't believe you're doing that, and your spouse said, you are so right. You are so right. I never thought about it, but that moment when you called me an idiot, it all became clear to me. Thank you so much for putting me in my place. None of our spouses have ever done that in the history of ever. It just doesn't happen. The world doesn't do that either. What Jesus understood with these people is by calling down fire on them and killing them, there was no hope for them. And as the church, when we decide to attack people, when they attack us, when we tell them, look, you're idiots for thinking what you're thinking, they're not going to say, oh, now I understand. So how do we change the people around us? Do we change them by attacking them? Or do we do as Jesus did? Maybe there's a power to meekness that isn't available in strength, in physical attacking strength. Maybe transformation starts in that. As we continue to look at this, we also see that Jesus showed meekness in something else. I want to look at one other story. It's in Mark chapter 14, verse 32 through 36. It's at the end of Jesus' life. And in this passage here, Jesus has already served communion to his disciples, and he's taken them out into the garden to pray with them. And then he goes to pray. This is the last night of Jesus' life before he dies, before he's arrested, betrayed. And it says this, and they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. In going a little farther, he fell on the ground and he prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible with you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. As Jesus went into suffering, as he was suffering in the most powerful way, he showed a meekness that isn't understandable in our world. So he goes in and he's praying, and he brings his disciples, and he asks them to stop and pray, and he keeps going into the garden, and he prays these words. He says, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. That word Abba, Father, is like daddy. He's calling out to God in the closest, most intimate possible terms, saying, please, Father, take this away from me. Yet I don't want to do what I want, but what you want. This is really hard to process because we feel like Jesus, as the Son of God, should never struggle with the commands of God. Right? We understand how we struggle with the commands of God, but we feel like Jesus shouldn't. But yet, on this very night, Jesus knew that he was going to suffer in a way that no human has ever suffered before or afterward. Why did he do this? What Jesus understood was, in a few hours he was going to be crucified, and he was going to pay for the price for every sin that has ever been committed. Now, think about yourself. Have you ever felt the pain of sin after you commit it? Now, we always want to sin. There's things that we want, and we want these things, and we think, I can't live without them. But as soon as you get that sin, have you ever felt that pain and that guilt that like you just wish it would have never happened? As soon as it happened, you just wish it would go away. I wish I would have never had that. I wish that decision would have happened, and that pain. What Jesus was about to experience was that pain for every sin that had ever been committed. And he understood that was coming. And so he says to his Father, he says, Father, Daddy, please, if there is any other way, take this cup from me. But I love his statement. He said, yet not what I will, but what you will. I don't want to do this, but I'm turning the control over to you. Meekness is power controlled by someone else. It's giving up control. My 15-year-old daughter is working on her learner's permit. She's got her learner's permit for driving. And so this is the point in time where I'm supposed to say, so everybody stay off the sidewalk because she's driving now. But that's not the point. She's learning to drive, and it's been fun. But a couple weeks ago, when I went to Taos, I told her, it's time for you to drive home. I'll ride with you. You're going to drive home. And so we drove back from Taos. It was dusk, and we got to do the windy road between Taos and Espanola while she was driving. And for a while, it was okay, but then she kept getting really close to the guardrails on the turns, and we're sitting on that side, and finally I was like, I'm going to need you to scoot more towards the middle of the road. This just isn't going to work. I said it in that way, too. I didn't yell at her. I didn't get on to her about it. I just said, I need you to scoot more over to the road. And she did. Later, we got to Santa Fe, and it was dark, and she drove through the traffic of Santa Fe like it was nothing. She did great. And then we got on the freeway for the first time. We got on at Cerrillos Road, and we turned towards the El Dorado exit, and she accelerated to 75, and we're driving right along, and then she never got out of the far right lane. At 75 miles an hour, she hit the next exit without slowing down. And we're cruising along, and she's just cruising right along, and I said, slow down, slow down, slow down, slow down, slow down! I'm yelling at her like this. And she hit the brakes, and she pulled over, and I said, okay, we're okay. We're okay. We can keep going. And she drove us the rest of the way home. Now, two signs of meekness in this story. One, I don't have a brake or a steering wheel in the passenger seat of my car. They make those. I just didn't think to buy one when I bought my car. But the reality is, in that moment, I was glad to have it. I actually turned control over to her, which was maybe a bad idea, but we got through it, and we're okay. But what is really important, and why I tell this story, is because what she did. In the car, I told her to scoot over, and she did. I told her to slow down in no uncertain terms, and she slowed down. She didn't have to. We could have died horrible, painful, burning deaths on the side of the road. But she chose to slow down at the command that I gave her. Two things she could have done. One, she could have kept going. The second thing that she could have done is stop the car and said, I can't do this. You're better at it than me. You take over, and I can't do this anymore. The first answer would have been dumb. The second one is the one I wanted to talk to you about. How many times do we tell God, God, I can't do this anymore. I just need you to take over. And then it's like he doesn't necessarily take it over. We're saying, God, I'm dealing with this sin. I can't make it stop. I can't seem to stop it. Just take it away from me. And then in the back of your mind, every time the sin starts to be tempting again, you hear his voice saying, you don't need this. In the same way that he did it before. You don't need this. I've got better for you. You don't have to make that decision. God doesn't just jump in an automaton, take you and just lift you up and move you. Instead, he allows you to humble yourself and walk in his will. Because that's when the transformation happens. Jesus, on the night that he was suffering, had the opportunity, as he's saying, God, I don't want this, to experience a new level of faith even for him. As he was in this place, God didn't take away the suffering. But what God did was strengthen him to walk through it. From this point forward, you see no part of the story where Jesus says, God, I can't do this anymore. He comforts him and he strengthens him and he walks through it because Jesus said, yet it's not my will that I need, but it's your will. There's something so important about understanding that God, when we turn our power over to him, will at times take us to places we don't want to go. Will at times take us on journeys that we don't want to go on. Will at times allow us to suffer in ways that we don't feel like we can. But this is why so many passages like Romans 5, where Paul says we rejoice in our sufferings because suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. We rejoice in suffering because God is going to do something with that we can't experience outside of it. We're all going to suffer in this world. We just are. But when we turn it over to God and say, God, I don't want this, but if this is what you want for me, I'm okay. When we do that, this is the point where God starts a real transformation inside of us. And Jesus exemplified that in the meekness that he showed at the feet of his Father, facing the worst suffering that anyone could ever experience. But not only did he exemplify that in that story, but right after that, we're going to finish with this in verse 37 through 42. He continued. And he came and he found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you might not enter temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and he prayed, saying the same words. And again he came back and he found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy and they did not know how to answer him. And he came to them a third time and he said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. This, for me, is the time when meekness is the most challenging. Jesus showed his meekness when he was abandoned. I can see being meek when you're attacked, because that's turning the other cheek. I can see being meek when you're suffering, because God says that suffering produces perseverance, and so I'm going to allow that. But I have a really hard time being meek when somebody lets me down. When people who should be there for me let me down. I have a really hard time with that. But what Jesus does is he tells his disciples, earlier on that night he had washed their feet. Then he gave them communion and he said, you're never going to get to eat this with me again until we're in my kingdom. And then he takes them out to the garden and he says, I'm about to die. You guys are going to betray me. And Peter says, even if everybody else betrays you, I'll never will. And Jesus says to him, just this very night, you're going to betray me 3 times. So they get out to the garden and they start praying, and Jesus says to them, just stay here and pray. And he goes in to pray and he comes back and he sees Peter and James and John and the disciples. He sees them sleeping when all he had done is ask them to pray. And he says, can't you stay awake for even an hour? I can't pray for an hour. Can't you stay awake for even an hour? And then he goes back in. And when he comes back, do you know what he finds? The worst night of his life, and he's asked his friends to do one thing for him. One thing, just pray. That's all I'm asking you to do. And he shows up and they're crashed out. And he goes back in because they don't even have words for him. They just look at him dumbfounded, it says. It says they don't even know how to answer him. And then he leaves and goes back, and you know what they do again? They just start sleeping. The guy that they had spent every day with for 3 years, the one that they said, you are the Messiah, you are the hope of the world, we know no truth but you, asks them to do one thing, just pray. And they crash out. You know what I do after the second time of finding them sleeping? I'm like, you know what, get up, get out. Right? I ask you to do one thing, just get out. You're all going to betray me anyway. I can't deal with this anymore. Just go away. I'm already suffering worse than anybody is ever going to suffer, and yet right now, all I'm asking you to do is stay awake and just go. That's what I would have said. And yet Jesus goes back in, and look at his last words to them. Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It's enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. Jesus, even in the last minute, invites them to follow him. Even in the last minute, when they have let him down 3 times, invites them to keep walking. That's meekness. Meekness is understanding that people are going to let you down, but you don't have to be in control. Meekness is understanding that people are going to fall short, people are going to attack you, people are going to do these things, but you don't have to have revenge. How does that happen? This gets us to the heart of this whole thing. It gets us to the place where we understand that meekness is me taking my power and I'm turning it over to God, not getting what I want, but I'm turning it over to him. And in doing so, in doing that, we become more than we could ever be on our own. Meekness is a picture of this. It's a picture of a stallion. I had a friend sharing this with me this week. It's the picture of a stallion who, out on the prairie, is able to run and do all these things. But when you take a stallion and you train it and you get it, you put a rider on it. It's got all this power and it's turning over its control to the rider behind it. Right? Now the stallion out on the prairie is beautiful, but the stallion with a rider on it is capable of doing so much more than the one without the rider is able to do, because the rider knows things for it to do that it would never know to do on its own. Right? It becomes something more than it could be as long as it's got its own control. On the prairie, all it's going to do is it's going to eat, it's going to sleep, it's going to poop, and it's going to make more stallions. Right? But once it's given itself to a rider, it can accomplish 1,000 other things. I hear you right now listening to that and thinking, yeah, but what does that have to do with me? Jesus says that the meek are blessed. And then he shows all of these examples. But all we're hearing the entire time is, I don't want to turn over control. If Jim doesn't turn his control over to God, if I don't turn my control over to God, all I'm going to do is eat, sleep, poop, and make more Jims. That's it. Right? That's going to be the purpose of my life. And what have I really accomplished? Nothing. Except make more tall people and more poop. And it's funny, but the reality is I've accomplished nothing for eternity. The only way that we can accomplish something that's eternal is when we're meek enough to let God use us. And so I ask you again, if I had bumper stickers that said, I am meek, would you want one in your car? This morning, from my bottom line, I've got this. Meekness is turning over power to the one that can really do something with it. How do we do that? 2 things. How do we own this? 1, stop trying to be all-powerful. Stop trying to be the one who's got to have the answers, the one who's got to be right, the one who's got to be in control, the one who's got to be in charge. God has gifted many of you with leadership abilities, but those abilities are nothing without God. And the second thing is this: take down the scoreboard. And what I mean by that is this: that one of the things that keeps us from being meek is we have a scoreboard in our minds We can remember all the things that people have done against us, and we have a hard time not keeping track. Because I have done all these things for these people, and then they did this for me. It's hard to be meek when you're keeping score. And we even do that with God. God, I did this for you. I did this for you. I got up every day this week and I read my Bible, and I still didn't get the raise that I wanted. Take down the scoreboard and allow him to have control. As we come to church here every week, we do something that is really the ultimate sign of meekness. We come and take communion. When we come to take this communion, we come to take this bread and this juice that are the picture of the sacrifice of Jesus for us. When you get up here, when you come to this table, you're saying to God, God, I can't do it without you. And that's all that meekness is. So I've got something that I want you to understand this morning. As you come forward to take this communion, turn over the control that you're holding on to. And I've got an honest challenge for you. If you're not ready to say in your mind, really being meek is to be blessed, if you're not ready to be meek, it may not be time to take communion. Paul says that if we do not take communion with a heart that is right, we're sinning against God. There have been times in my life when I haven't taken communion because I realize I'm not where I need to be. So as you come down now, let God show you again why it's good to give him control. Why it's good to let him have it. Let's pray together. Our mighty God, I praise you for your